Yeah, how does that sound? Good. We should have like subtitles, shouldn't we, for the accent? Thanks very much for that introduction, Shantikar. I wasn't going to... I will be using it. I'm going to just do a little kind of reflection first. Is that any better? I'm easier to move than the lectern. Yeah, so Shantikar is saying about joy, and I just went through my mind, actually, that's what my name means. So Dhammarati means sort of joy or delight in the Dharma. And I was struck by a couple of the speakers, of Pratnagosha and Sadanandi. They were both saying that there's moments of challenge in Dharma practice. There's times where it's quite demanding. And that's true. But actually, also, it's a delight. Just what was, as I was coming over, just sort of watching a little cluster of people watching the sun go down. And I don't know if everybody's found this, but you do a bit of meditation practice. It's like your capacity to see things goes up. You're clearer, you're more open, you're more receptive. Just basically, Dharma practice supports a deeper, richer experience. And the reason I do it, I'm willing to engage with moments of challenge, but only because it's worth it. And on the other side, you're stepping into something, opening up to something deeply satisfying. So anyway, well spotted, Shantikara. The verse that we're going to do tonight is Padmasambhava's advice to the Queen to give urgent attention to impermanence. And I think it's quite interesting how it's phrased. So Padmasambhava is not saying think about impermanence. He's not saying figure out if you agree with it or not. He's saying give it urgent attention. So before I'd say anything else, I thought we would just take Padmasambhava at his own advice and give some attention to impermanence. So I wanted to start off just by asking us to, let's just spend 5 minutes doing a little bit of reflection. And one of the things about impermanence in Buddhism, it's like it's saying not that impermanence is something separate. It's not some idea. It's not some philosophical postulate. It's basically saying if you start to pay attention to your experience, what you start to notice more and more is everything that you're attending to is this unfolding flow of experience. And impermanence is the core of it. And there's something just to start to see that. It changes how we understand ourselves, how we respond. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just take a few minutes and see if that's true or not. So, sit comfortably. And just whatever helps us tune into ourselves right now, just how do you feel? How's your body? And all of you on this weekend kind of know already that the Buddhist tradition just uses this very simple experience of the breath as a way of connecting us to our experience. So just noticing the next in-breath. Just following Padmasambhava's advice, not just noticing, but attending to it. What's that breath like? What does it feel like to be breathing? So whatever helps you to connect to that really simple, direct experience, just that felt sense of breathing. I know you've been doing this all weekend, but this time just maybe give a bit more attention to the flow of the breath. That sense of the breath coming in and going out. Just see if it's possible to be present to this next breath as it begins. Is it possible to keep that attention through its duration? And still be attending to it, still connected to it at the end. If you can, see if it's possible to be with the breath just as it begins to arise out of stillness. Just alive to the beginning of the breath. And just noticing in the same way that every breath fades. Not an idea, but just noticing each out breath fading back into that stillness. Being with the stillness in the same way that we're able to be with the breath. And broadening our awareness out to become aware of the breath and the whole body. Aware of it in our back, in our belly, in our chest. What does the body feel like as the breath comes in and goes out? Maybe just noticing what sensation in your body maybe one of the sensations associated with breathing. But what's most present? What's most distinct? If you can, just breathe into that sensation. Just being a little more attentive to it. Just a question, is that sensation staying the same? Or if you attend to it, does it change? If it's possible, just being aware of how you feel right now. Just letting the awareness include that, breathing into it. Sensitive to feelings. I breathe in, I breathe out. Same question again. If you're able to get a sense of those feelings, is that something stable? Is it something that's changing? And to finish, just coming back to the breath. It's always a little awkward when we start to be aware of the breath. It maybe changes it a little. But just is it possible to let the breath be just as it is? If it's a long breath, just noticing it's a long breath. If it's a short breath, just noticing it's a short breath. Vajratara earlier today was talking about that image of the blue sky. That sense of the awareness just having that quality of openness. Just accommodating, responsive to whatever the breath is naturally doing. And just keeping, if you can, that sort of sense of connection to yourself, just staying grounded in that. Just bringing your awareness back into the tent. Let's see if we can say a little more about impermanence. So at the risk of labouring the point, thanks. If I did a bit more presence of mind, I was going to get us just to notice like sounds in the room, and going to suggest that it's the same again. You can hear a sound rise, you can hear it fall, and the sun that we were looking at 20 minutes ago, 30 minutes ago, is below the horizon. It's just starting to get dark. The audience is getting a little bit harder to see. And what the Buddhist tradition is saying is that that element of impermanence is, in a sense, it's the core, it's the essence, if that makes sense, of anything that we attend to. And taking awareness into that. So this verse is Padmasambhava saying, give urgent attention to impermanence. I want to say something about each of those words, but let's just start off with the attention. And as you take attention to experience at all, according to the Buddhist tradition, your experience starts to change. And if I had more time, that's already taken a bit more time really than I had intended. But I'd be interested to hear what people's experience is, but I won't spend time doing that. But I want to suggest that if you stick with that kind of instruction, this instruction to be aware of impermanence, something kind of paradoxical happens. A lot of the time we're quite caught in our experience. And like I've been doing this practice for a little while, and I think probably for most people, when you start to take awareness into experience like that, something a bit paradoxical happens. So on the one hand, you're more alive to what's actually happening. So you're more alive to the experience of the breath, a bit more alive to the body. You gradually get to tune in to how you feel, basically, to that flow of experience. And one of the famous texts on awareness, the Satipatthana Sutta, talks about awareness being internal and external. So that same quality of attending to experience isn't just ourselves, it's a sort of, again, I sort of wonder if any of you have found this over the weekend, but maybe a little bit more kind of aware of the vividness of people, the distinctiveness of people, a little bit more of a free-flowing exchange of energy. Not all the time. I went for lunch and I was sitting there a little socially awkward as people sort of sat down round about me. But in those moments when we're a little bit less self-conscious, there's that sense of just the way that we're more aware of ourselves, we're more aware of, more responsive to the world round about us. And at the same time, less caught in it. That there's, again, this metaphor of the blue sky, this sort of openness, this spaciousness. So you get this kind of paradox of, on the one hand, there's an openness to experience, you're less caught in the experience, and at the same time more alive to it and more responsive to it. So I hope that's got some echoes in people's experience, maybe in the meditation, maybe just in the atmosphere over the last few days. So I want to come on to this whole instruction from Padmasambhava of giving urgent attention to experience. And I hope this isn't, to impermanence. I hope this isn't too discursive, but when I was writing the talk, what came to mind was a visit I made a few years ago to Borobudur in Java. I was going to give a slideshow, actually. I've got some nice photographs, but I thought it would be too much trouble setting up the projector and the screen. So I decided not to do it. So I'll try and describe the slides. Borobudur is extraordinary. It's this architectural mandala in the middle of the jungle in Java. It's about 300 feet square and it's about 150 feet high. And it has these different levels. They rediscovered it as they did everywhere in the 1900s, and they sort of excavated it. So it's a big accessible thing now, laid out like a mandala if you see it from above. And it's a really interesting architectural experience. I can't help thinking the architects had a meditation practice. But the experience of walking around the different levels of Borobudur. So on the bottom level, you're walking down a corridor that's got walls that are higher than head height. So you're kind of enclosed. And the walls of this passageway that go around the whole 300-foot square of it are beautiful. That they're decorated with friezes of previous lives of the Buddha. And then you go up a set of stairs and you're into the next corridor and you're walking around and you're looking at friezes of the present life of the Buddha, the life of the historical Buddha, really beautifully carved. They're some of the most refined bits of Buddhist art that you find. But then once you've done that level, there's a change. There's another staircase that you go through. But before you go through the staircase, one of the bits of architecture is above the doorway to the staircase, there's a monster. There's a big pair of eyes, a top lip, and the doorway is the jaws of the monster. So to get to the next level, you have to step into the jaws of this monster. Right. And if you look a little bit more carefully, to begin with, the monster looks quite scary, bulging eyes, big lips, fangs. But then you realise, actually, it's been done quite affectionately, that the sculptors have obviously had a bit of fun with the monster. And even it's slightly comical, so that you start to look at the big pop eyes and the big gaping doorway of a mouth. And there's just this slight hint of comedy in it. And the monster is impermanence. So you're about to step into something that at first glance looks a little bit scary. You look a little bit closer and it's not so scary. And you go through the doorway, you go up the stairway, and there's this absolutely spectacular opening out. You're suddenly out of the walls. You're 100 feet high. You're above the tree line, and it's just this spectacular opening up to blue sky. And you can see for miles in every direction. There's nothing. There's the trees below you, and then the whole plain is ringed by volcanic mountains. So it's this incredible sense of coming out of the enclosure of the walls into this wide open space. And you're sharing the space with Buddhas. So all around this level, there are some Buddhas out in the open, and there's these beautiful little baskets, little stone baskets. And if you look through the wicker work of the baskets, in each of the baskets, another Buddha. So you've just come out of these walls into the open space, and you're surrounded by Buddhas. And the way you get to that open space is stepping through the jaws of impermanence, which turns out not to be quite as scary as it looked like at first glance. So there's something in that. I think the reason I'm saying the architects had a meditation practice is that I think that stupa, that bit of architecture, gives you a feel for how experience changes as you start to pay urgent attention to impermanence. Paradoxically, in attending to impermanence, in that opening up, in that letting go that happens, there's a spaciousness and a clarity and an openness that in some ways my slideshow would have given you a better idea than a more philosophical description of it. But let's have a go anyway. So impermanence is absolutely central in the Buddhist tradition. And the situation that we're in with the Queen talking to Padmasambhava, Queen says to Padmasambhava, "Give me a few words of great import, an effective verse which I can memorise, which at a later time would lead me to Buddhahood." So you're already in a particular tradition of Buddhist teaching. And this idea that the Queen's asking for an effective verse which she can memorise, which will lead her to Buddhahood. There's a tradition in Buddhism, especially in Tibetan Buddhism, called mind training verses. And the mind training verses are an attempt to give you really short, pithy statements that give you access to the experience that the Dharma is trying to point to. So one of the mind training verses is train with slogans. Right, so the whole Buddhist tradition is enormous. There's a Pali tradition, an Indian tradition, a Chinese tradition, a Tibetan tradition, a Japanese tradition, a Chinese tradition. You're not going to get through all of the texts. And basically it's the creativity of Buddhism. It's just the whole tradition trying to say, look, this is what it's like. This is how you would do it. But it's so much material that actually to get to something that really makes an impact on our experience, you need something that you remember, that you've got access to at a time where you're able to use it in a way that supports a shift in your experience. So what the Queen is asking Padmasambhava for is a verse that she can memorise. And Padmasambhava gives her this little condensed teaching that in some ways, I think it's an overstatement to say you can get the whole of the Buddhist path from the 3 lines that we've been asked to talk about these 3 evenings. So the first one is pay urgent attention to impermanence. Strongly turn your mind towards taking refuge, and then direct your prayers towards the Lama. So I'm going to say quite a bit more about this, but basically it's saying attend to that aspect of your experience that causes suffering, basically, or that leaves you with the experience of dissatisfaction. So you're attending to impermanence. You're looking to move towards something deeper than that. So you turn your mind towards taking refuge. And we're able to learn from people whose practice is deeper than ours. So turn your prayer towards the Lamas. So basically you're in a situation, if there's a sense of disease, of dissatisfaction, start to notice that, start to take awareness into it. You get an intuitive sense that something deeper is possible. And to support that intuitive sense, you start to learn from how other people have engaged with this, how they've moved towards that deeper experience. And the whole Buddhist tradition really is just a communication, a transmission of the Buddha, the teachers that have followed him, trying to explain to us how they moved into that deeper experience. So Padmasambhava is setting that up. And he's pointing to something that's interesting, I think, this idea that the Queen has asked for something that moves her in the direction of enlightenment. So it's the deepest Buddhist experience. And Padmasambhava starts with impermanence. So that's the teaching that he gives her. So in this last evening, we're starting with the first verse, the first teaching. Urgently attend to impermanence. So I was saying before, impermanence runs through the whole tradition. The in the Pali tradition, what's called the three lakshanas. And lakshanas just means marks. So it's the things that define conditioned reality. And the first of these is impermanence. Second of these is dukkha, and that the sense of, you could call it suffering, you could call it not being fully satisfied. But really, dukkha follows from impermanence. It basically saying that nothing impermanent can be the basis for permanent satisfaction. So dukkha really just follows from impermanence. And then the third one is this, in a way, more profound teaching of anatta, that there's no fixed self. But in a sense, again, that just follows from impermanence. You start to look at this flow of experience, and the deeper you look, the more open that flow becomes, the more flow from you to the world, from the world to you, the sort of the dialogue, the conversation that we have with the whole of reality, or at least the bits of it that are in front of us. But all of that really comes from this starting to notice that at the core of all of our experience, you're looking at this unfolding stream of becoming, of arising and passing, arising from the stillness, fading back into the stillness. All of that is, according to the tradition, one of the marks of any experience whatsoever. You find it in the later Mahayana tradition, quote from the Diamond Sutra. If you know any Buddhist scriptures, I'm just going to be reading you quotes that you know already, so feel free to join in. But so from the Diamond Sutra, this is how to contemplate our existence in this fleeting world, like a tiny drop of dew, a bubble floating in a stream, a flash of lightning in a summer cloud, a flickering lamp, an illusion, a phantom, a dream. So is all conditioned existence to be seen. Tibetan tradition, again, a famous quote from Tsongkhapa, all worldly things are brief, like lightning in the sky. This life you must know as the tiny splash of a raindrop, a thing of beauty that disappears even as it comes into being. Therefore I recall what is most deeply important to me and make use of every day and night to achieve it. That last bit maybe gives you a little link to the urgent part of it. I love that little verse. It's saying it's a thing of beauty. You know, what you're attending to, you're even more alive to the beauty of it. But you're watching it come and you're watching it fade. A thing of beauty that disappears even as it comes into being. So the tradition, Padmasambhava, is trying to take our experience to that. Not making an argument for it, not asking if we agree with it. What's it like to attend to it? Right. And there's a couple of things to say about this. It's not hard to understand the idea of impermanence. Right. It's pretty empirical. You know, anywhere you look, you can kind of see that process happening. But to see it, even to agree with it, isn't deep enough. So this instruction is not to think about it, it's to attend to it. And what you're doing in meditation practice, for example, is you're starting to get a sense of it in your body. You're starting to get a sense of it in your feelings. You're starting to notice it in the shape your mind takes. So your whole being is starting to engage with, to attend to, and to respond to this living sense of all of our experience, a process of coming into being and passing. So to feel it in your blood, in your bones, in your breath, in your feelings, in the activity of your mind is something different from, in a way, kind of getting it as an idea. important though that's a first step. So the first instruction of Padmasambhava is to pay attention to it. And out of that, again, I hope you get a wee bit of a sense of it from the Borobudur image, from the little meditation that we did. It can sound a little bit scary, realising that all of your experience is impermanent. But actually the experience of it, paradoxically, is that if anything, in that openness, in that spaciousness, in being a little bit less tight around the experience, will become even more alive to it and responsive to it. You step through the doorway and you're into that open space. So, philosophically, impermanence is central to the Buddhist tradition. The whole Buddhist philosophical tradition, you could say, is just a statement and a restatement of impermanence and the implications of impermanence. But in a sense, impermanence is even more central than that. In the community here, we were studying a text called the Aryapariyesana Sutta. And the Aryapariyesana Sutta gets translated as the Noble Quest. Don't know how that lands with a modern audience. The Dungeons and Dragon players, if that still gets done, might resonate. But sort of basically, it's the Buddha trying to explain what it was that took him to spiritual practice in the first place. There's this lovely little story. It's the Buddha arrives at a hermitage, the sutta explains. And I haven't really got time to explain this, but I will anyway. The Buddha's so polite. He gets to this hermitage and he hears the monks talking inside, and decides not to go in while they're still talking. So this is the Buddha we're talking about, right? And he decides not to interrupt the monks. Waits till there's a break in the conversation, knocks politely on the door, and they let him in. So the Buddha goes in, sits down, starts talking to the monks. And he says to them, "What were you talking about before I interrupted you?" And the monks say, "Funnily enough, we were talking about you." And then, who would believe it? You turn up and you knock on the door and here you are. So the Buddha decides to tell them about his own experience. And where he goes is to a description of him in his 20s. And I think it's maybe a wee bit hard to get to the Buddha's life story fresh. You know, we're so used to the images like this, the iconograph, the Buddha. We get it through these texts written by people who were in awe of the Buddha. But this is the Buddha talking before he was enlightened. And the way he describes it, he says, "I was a black-haired young man with the blessings of youth in the first stage of my first stage of life." And he says, "Then it occurred to me, why do I, being impermanent myself, look for happiness in what is also impermanent?" And then he says, "What if I, being impermanent myself, being subject to birth, to death, were to seek instead the unborn, what is not subject to birth, what is not subject to death?" So you've got this young man in his mid-20s trying to think, I don't know if this raises any echoes, but trying to think, what am I doing with my life? What is this whole thing for? There's another little detail in the text where his parents don't like the way he's thinking. So his parents are in tears at the process that this young 20-year-old or mid-20-year-old is going through, trying to figure out what to do with his life. They've got him lined up to carry on the family business, which is ruling the kingdom. And he's thinking, I don't want to do this. I want to look at what's not subject to birth and to death. So you get this it just struck me when I was thinking of the audience here, a young man, mid-20s, arguing with his parents about what he should be doing with his life. Don't know if this strikes any chords or not. But the Buddha's conclusion is maybe a little bit more profound than the one that I came to when I was going through this process in my mid-20s. So the Buddha says, what if I, being subject myself to impermanence, subject to birth, to death, were to seek the unborn, the deathless release? So I just realised when I was studying this time, it's a brilliant question. It's a question that gets right to the core of the quality of our experience, and starting to realise again this point that nothing that's impermanent can be the basis for stable, satisfying experience. Why do I, being impermanent, look for what's happiness and what is also impermanent? So this fundamental realisation. Sangharakshita in the seminar that he led about this says, I don't think we have to look at this as the sort of thing that the Buddha has worked out. It's presented like that, but I don't think it could have happened like that. It's much more spontaneous, much more immediate, even more urgent than that. It could even have been spread over quite a long period of time. So you got this sense of somebody quite troubled trying to really address the deep issues. You get these traditional stories of the four sights, which don't appear in the Arya Pariyesana Sutta. And I guess, like for all of us, young or older, that's a perennial question of just how do we respond to the world around us, to the way our own life, the shape our life is taking. And quite often there's a movement towards something, an intuitive sense of something deeper that you can't always articulate. I found myself quite often using the quote from an American psychologist called James Hillman. And Hillman says, purpose in our lives doesn't usually appear as a clearly framed goal, but more likely it appears as a troubling, unclear urge, coupled with a sense that it's indubitably important. Purpose comes with a force, but what it is and how to get to what it's pointing to remains unclear. So I love that image that you've got a real sense that something matters, but you can't necessarily articulate what it is or how to get towards what it is. I think in a very general way that describes human experience. It's a troubling urge before it's anything clearer than that. So that's the situation that the Buddha's in. The Sangharakshita says the Buddha places before the monks in a very radical form two radical alternatives. In the first case, there's the impermanent in pursuit of the impermanent. In the second case, the impermanent in pursuit of what is not impermanent, the conditioned in pursuit of the unconditioned, to use traditional Buddhist language. So that's the situation that the Buddha's in, and the impetus for that is seeing the impermanence of his own experience. So again, not just philosophical, long before it's philosophy, it's this felt sense of something not quite satisfactory, an intuitive sense that something deeper, something more fulfilling is possible. And out of that comes, as the Buddha describes to the monks, the impetus for his own exploration of spiritual practice. Another wee line from Sangharakshita, he says that to see something, you just can't go on like that anymore. The instant that you see your conditionedness, you have a sort of glimpse of your unconditionedness. To see yourself as the conditioned in pursuit of the conditioned is already to start the pursuit of the unconditioned. So again, that might not be language that you would use. It might not immediately fit your experience, but that glimpse, when you start to see how the habitual way we respond limits us, and that glimpse that there's a possible quality of experience beyond that, you get an intuition for the direction that you need to move in, to move, as the Buddha describes here, in the direction of unbinding, of liberation, of release. So Padmasambhava goes on, not making a philosophical case for it, but trying to explain the conditions that support that experience. So let me just say something briefly about those. He goes on to say, the tranquility of shunyata is the foundation. And you could say actually the tranquility of impermanence is the foundation. Shunyata and impermanence is basically the later tradition restating the earlier tradition. So the tranquility of shunyata is the foundation. And then he says, lay bare whatsoever arises, good and bad thoughts alike. After careful examination, understand to neither accept nor reject, and peace will arise from within. So I hope that's helpful. What you've got to do is to rest in the tranquility of shunyata, lay bare whatsoever arises, good or bad thoughts alike, and after careful examination, neither accept nor reject them. And then peace will arise. And I'm sorry if this is foolhardy, but I wanted to try and just have a go at explaining what that meant. So let's just take a few minutes on that, if you don't mind. So you've got this situation where the Buddha's saying that the habitual human experience is we're kind of habitually, compulsively looking to their experience around us for happiness. We try to pull towards us the pleasant experience. We try to defend ourselves from unpleasant experience, whether it's an external situation, whether it's a feeling that arises, that's the starting point. And what the Buddha's doing is this move from trying to get satisfaction from what's impermanent to what is not conditioned by impermanent experience. So what the Buddhist tradition basically says is that you have to take your attention from what's out there, the impermanent objects that we're attending to, and you have to start to look instead at the quality of your response to what we're attending to. And this is what Padmasambhava is describing, really. So traditional Buddhism says that we tend to pull towards us the pleasant, we tend to push away the unpleasant, and both of those shut us down. That pulling towards, that pushing away, both of them kind of, the later tradition talks about it as grasping. So we sort of create a limited awareness as opposed to that openness that just lets the breath be what it is. So that quality of openness is what the practice is trying to move us towards. And Padmasambhava, in this instruction, tries to suggest an alternative. So he says, lay bare whatsoever arises, good and bad thoughts alike. So basically it's get out of the habit of focusing in on one aspect of reality and trying to shut out everything that slightly freaks us out, right? And just looking for a quality of laying bare. Laying bare is a wee bit clinical, but in the same way that you're not trying to control the breath, you're just allowing it to be as it is. You're not trying to, at least to begin with, control the feelings. Before you do anything, just let them have their life, let them live. So it's that quality of laying bare, which means opening up to, connecting to experience. Then the second step is After careful examination, neither accept nor reject. And if we do that, peace will arise. Now, I want to say something about that. I hope this isn't being presumptuous, but at least as a point of access, I think that's simpler than it sounds. So the habit, according to the Buddhist tradition, is that we tend to cling to the pleasurable. And what's being suggested is instead of that clinging, there's an appreciation, but it's an appreciation that just lets it have its life, that lets it come into being and lets it pass. So it's not a disconnecting, it's not a cutting off, it's not an asceticism, but it's noticing that habit of how we tighten up, how we close down, how we cling, how we try to belong. And it's just relaxing back into letting something have its own natural life. So we replace again, this is traditional language, we replace clinging with non-clinging. Or in the language of the later tradition, we replace clinging with openness. So it's just that spaciousness that allows experience to arise. And then unpleasant experience, according to the tradition, we habitually push away. We have a response of aversion. And what the practice instructions are, aversion gets replaced by non-aversion, or even you can say love. So when unpleasant experience arises, it's not that you're not paying attention, it's not that you're not discriminating. But what's being said is instead of the habit of resisting or the habit of pushing away, there's the same quality of openness, the same quality of attention, and we respond to our own painful experience with love rather than aversion. Or we come into relationship with people around us, people who we tend to react to, people we tend to shut down in relation to, and you notice what that shutting down feels like, and you relax back into the openness, and you open up to yourself with a bit of empathy. You start to get a bit curious about the people around us. We open up to them with empathy. So the tendency to close down around something, we relax back into openness and connection. The tendency to push away, we relax back into openness and empathy, openness and kindness, openness and love. And in that openness, something starts to happen, right? So your experience is less and less being shaped by what it is that we come in contact with, that the habits of closing down around the clinging, the acceptance, closing down around the aversion, the rejection, those habits are less and less influential. And that capacity just to be alive to what arises, to allow it to be there in awareness, to respond to it with enjoyment if it's pleasurable, empathy if it's painful, that openness and that capacity for responsiveness becomes more and more of an established current in our experience. So in a sense, that, if I may be so presumptuous, this language of the conditioned in search of the unconditioned, you get maybe a little bit of a flavour of that in this quality of awareness that's more and more consistent, more and more just coming out of our own decision to respond with that quality of openness. As Padmasambhava says, strongly turn towards going for refuge. So it's just recognising that our minds have that capacity to let go into that spaciousness and to respond in a way that's not shaped by, not conditioned by what it is that we're encountering. And out of that, this process of liberation starts. I won't go into a lot of detail, but the tradition is beautifully psychologically precise. Basically, it says you start to be aware of your breath, start to be aware of your body. It's a deep relief. You start to be connected to yourself. You start to tune in to how you feel. You're opening up to your own pleasurable experience, your own painful experience, and there's a sense of connection and a sense of wholeness that comes out of that act of attention. And out of that sense of connection and wholeness, we're not grasping after experience to fill us up. There's just a centeredness, a groundedness, and a responsiveness that allows us to move more and more fully into that openness. So what Padmasambhava is saying here is, first of all, notice the impermanence. You don't have to hold it so tightly. In that less tight awareness, good and bad thoughts can arise without acceptance, without rejection. Just a quality of attending to whatever arises, and an openness and responsiveness that's appropriate to that. So basically, Padmasambhava said something deeper, far more succinctly than that. But that move maybe gives us an idea of the choice that the Buddha was talking about, noticing how, as long as we're shaped by the accidents of what we attend to, we're just thrown about by experience, and actually something that moves us towards unconditioned and liberated is possible. Going back to impermanence, it takes a long time. In a sense, that's true. Going back to this idea of challenge, to really feel your way into the implications of impermanence. But the basic idea is as close as your next breath, right? The attending to impermanence is totally accessible. We can start to take awareness to that. And similarly, this process the process I was describing there really comes from what's called the awakening factors. There's a process of awakening that the tradition describes very kind of precisely. But that the first step, to quote Ratnagosha from the first night, first step of that is just starting to take awareness into experience and to make that decision to unhook from the habits and to start to wake up to what's actually going on in our experience, how we're responding, and choosing to respond out of openness and not craving, out of kindness and not aversion. And that's a choice that we can make. It's a choice that's available basically moment by moment to all of us. And the going for refuge is the just having enough of a slogan to remind us that if we want to take that step, that we can take that step. So it's the last night of the retreat. Shantikara was explaining why we were having the first verse last. And the reason for that, he said, is impermanence, the end of a retreat. And it's this fantastic description of conditions, right? All of us have our complex lives. All of us, for whatever reason we chose to, came here on this retreat. I hope that on the retreat, all of us have had either a glimpse of something deeper, or if that glimpse was already there, conditions that supported us moving towards something deeper. But like any other set of conditions that come together, in a few hours the conditions start to move away, we all go our separate ways. And what's been this, I've loved watching people on the retreat, sort of interacting a little bit with people on the retreat, but what's been a coming together in a way that supports that deeper experience starts to dissolve again, like every other conditioned phenomenon. And as I say, I hope people have had a sort of glimpse of something. But one of the takeaways, I hope, is this instruction to turn strongly towards going for refuge. And all that means, I think, well, not all it means, but one of the things it means is that having had that intuition of what's possible in whatever way we explain it to ourselves and whatever way we feel is important to us, just this sense of it doesn't arise by accident, that sort of deeper experience. There are patterns within impermanence. Certain conditions support that arising of awareness. So meditation practice supports it, ethical practice supports it, communication with other people, as I hope we've found out on this retreat, supports it. And this injunction or this request to turn strongly towards going for refuge, it's just recognising the habits are strong. Like we're biologically hardwired to respond out of confusion or craving or aversion. That change is possible, but that change needs a certain continuity of intention, enough energy for the mind to start to move towards awareness. So I hope our instruction that we're taking away, if we've touched something that we've felt is valuable, however we've felt that, however we understand it, is just that decision to take the first step, as Ratnagosha was saying, and to move strongly towards going for refuge, in that sense of choosing to set up the conditions that support the continued emergence of that deeper current in our experience. It's been lovely having you. I hope you come back.